Hello, welcome to the Prior Authorization and Connectivity Operating Rule Set tutorial presented by myself, Erin Weber, and Bob Bowman, the co-directors of CAQH Core. In today's presentation, we will walk through the 3 operating rules proposed by the CAQH Core Board to the National Committee on Vital and Health Statistics, or NCVHS, for potential federal mandate via HIPAA. Industry has been talking for a long time about the lagging adoption of prior authorization. CAQH Core has spent a lot of time trying to understand what some of these barriers are. A fully manual prior authorization costs the industry an average of $14.23, whereas a fully electronic prior authorization costs less than $2. That's a difference of more than $12 per transaction. Barriers to automation include the need for consistency in data content, the lack of integration between clinical and administrative systems, low vendor support, state requirements for manual intervention, the lack of understanding of the breadth of information available on the 278 transaction, and the lack of awareness that this standard prior authorization transaction is federally mandated, particularly among the provider community. There's currently no federal mandated attachment standards to communicate clinical documentation, and organizations are at varying levels of maturity along the standards and technology adoption curve, making interoperability a challenge. That's why in February 2020, the CAQH Core Board sent a letter to NCVHS proposing a set of operating rules for federal mandate under HIPAA, including the CAQH Core Prior Authorizations and Referrals Data Content Rule, a companion infrastructure rule, as well as the CAQH Core Connectivity Rule version C3.1.0, formerly the Phase 4 Connectivity Rule. The CAQH Core Board proposed that this connectivity rule apply not only to the prior authorization transaction, but also to the eligibility, claim status, and electronic remittance advice transactions. Currently, outdated versions of the connectivity rules are federally mandated for those 3 additional transactions. By applying version C3 across these 4 transactions, we would have consistent connectivity requirements across the industry for these HIPAA administrative transactions. In June 2020, Core sent a letter updating NCVHS on the restructuring of our operating rules, and the hearing on the proposed rule package is scheduled for August 25th and 26th in DC. Public comments must be submitted to NCVHS by July 24th. We hope this tutorial will help you develop your comments. More than 125 unique organizations collectively contributed to the development of these rules through more than 75 subgroup and workgroup calls and approximately 35 straw polls and ballots. Each of these rules received at least 80% support in the CAQH Core participant vote on the rules. So on slide 3, I want to highlight the big picture impact of the 3 proposed operating rules before we get into the detailed rule requirements. This slide depicts a typical pended prior authorization experience. The black text on the slide indicates what will typically occur via the 278 transaction, and the purple text highlights the impact of the proposed operating rule set. The provider populates the transaction request and sends it to the health plan for adjudication. Because of the operating rules, the provider includes information to identify the patient, servicing and rendering provider, and the service for which the prior auth is requested. This results in a complete set of demographic data that improves patient and subscriber matching. The provider knows that the health plan has standard system availability and will communicate any downtime to the provider. And Safe Harbor connectivity method ensures that the provider and health plan are capable and ready to exchange prior authorization data. So then the health plan receives the 278 request. They're required to acknowledge the receipt within 20 seconds if the request is submitted via real time, and 2 business days when submitted via batch. The health plan then normalizes the patient's name to ensure patient matching, and the health plan communicates the most specific errors and associated reject reason codes back to the provider if such occurs. The health plan then replies in this scenario with a pended 278 response. The health plan, because of the rules, returns the most specific reason codes to offer the most comprehensive explanation to the provider, rather than giving a generic penned reason, which is really of no value to the provider. When the 278 request is pended due to the need for additional documentation, the health plan returns codes to communicate what additional documentation is needed within 2 business days from the receipt of the request. This includes the time it takes to acknowledge the request. The provider then receives the health plan's response, and in this scenario is responsible for sending additional documentation to the health plan. Again, because of the operating rules, this process is improved because that provider system is required to detect and display code definitions, which reduce the provider's interpretation burden. When the provider sends back the additional information, because they received information about what is needed electronically from the health plan, they don't need to manually call the health plan to obtain guidance, which further reduces their burden. And finally, then the health plan receives the additional documentation from the provider and has to make a final determination on the prior authorization once they have everything they need to make that decision. They have 2 business days following the receipt of the complete request from the provider, and the patient is now authorized for care. Another requirement within the infrastructure rule is that if the provider doesn't respond to the request for additional documentation after 15 business days, the health plan may choose to close out the pending request and account for all requests with a response. So that gives you kind of an overview, big picture of the operating rule requirements. But now I'm going to go through the details of the 2 prior auth rules and then turn it over to Bob to talk about connectivity. The CAQH core data content prior authorization rule standardizes the data related to the exchange of information for procedures, laboratory testing, medical services, device, and medications within the medical benefit. It addresses one of the most significant problem areas in the prior authorization process, requests for medical services that are pended due to missing or incomplete information. The rule gives health plans a more robust electronic means of communicating with providers about missing clinical information and documentation. The rule requirements reduce the unnecessary back and forth between providers and health plans, accelerates adjudication timeframes, and reduces provider resources spent on manual follow-up like phone calls. So this slide is organized by each step of the prior authorization process, where the operating rule requirements fit in, and what the impact is on the workflow. So the first requirement of the data content rules relates to consistent patient identification and verification on prior auth requests. This reduces common errors and denials by providing a complete set of demographic data to ensure a better patient-subscriber match. The second one is the receipt and processing of diagnosis, procedure, and revenue codes for specified categories of service, enabling auto adjudication through the support of use case-driven system application design. The third requirement is the return of healthcare service decision reason codes to provide the most comprehensive information back to the provider in the next steps. Fourth is the use of LOINC and PWK report type codes to communicate what additional clinical documentation is needed from the provider to move a pending prior authorization request forward. Fifth is the additional guidance on situational use of AAA error codes and corresponding action codes, which strengthens the electronic communication, reducing the need for a provider to manually follow up with a health plan. And finally, the requirement for vendors, essentially, of providers to detect and display all of the code descriptions, which reduces the burden of interpretation on the provider. The next slide introduces the CAQH core prior authorization and referrals infrastructure rule, which establishes foundational requirements to build consistency with other operating rules for HIPAA transactions. These foundational requirements include receipt acknowledgement, connectivity methods, required response times, minimum system availability, and a common companion guide format. The rule ensures electronic prior authorization information is shared in an organized, trusted, and consistent way. In 2019, CAQH core participants actually updated the rule to include 3 new response time requirements, encouraging progressive system enhancements to further advance the prior authorization process along the automation spectrum. So those of you familiar with other CAQH core operating rules, each transaction set has an infrastructure rule, and so this is how it applies to the 278. So again, I'm going to walk through each of the requirements here, starting with the standard companion guide format that enables consistency in how information is shared across trading partners. Then we'll move on to system availability, which sets provider expectations on standard system availability plus notification of any downtime. Acknowledgements allow for the provider to immediately learn whether the health plan has received the prior authorization request rather than needing to manually follow up. The fourth requirement that I want to highlight are the new response time requirements. I want to remind you that these response time requirements only apply when entities are exchanging the 278 transaction for prior authorization. So again, these rules do not apply to web portals or manual exchange of prior authorization information. The first response time requirement, added again in 2019, is the initial response, which is a maximum response time for the availability of a response, whether it be a pen, approval, or denial, to be picked up by a provider is 2 business days following the submission of the request. This sets clear provider expectations on the time frame to hear an initial response from the health plan, reducing the burden on help desk. The second time frame requirement is the 2-day final determination. So once all the requested information by the health plan has been received from the provider, the health plan then has 2 business days to send a response containing a final determination. This requirement moves the industry towards greater automation and reduces the time frame to communicate what additional information is needed to move a request forward in the adjudication process. It also enables timely final determination, which helps ensure the safety and appropriateness of medical treatment. Let's remember again, these rules are really all about improving the patient experience and patient care, and getting a timely prior authorization response is critical. And the fourth, or the 4C, the optional closeout requirement, again, I mentioned this earlier, the health plan can choose to close out a request, but the additional information needed to make the final determination is not provided by the provider in 15 business days. This allows to efficient closeouts due to inactivity and less back and forth between a plan and provider. The fifth requirement I want to highlight here, and Bob will go into more detail in a minute, is the requirement to support version C3.1.0 core connectivity. This safe harbor connectivity method ensures providers and health plans are capable and ready to exchange data, reducing trading partner onboarding time. And now I'll turn it over to Bob to give a little bit more detail on the connectivity requirements.
Great, thank you, Erin. And as Erin mentioned, one of the key requirements and proposals that the core board made to the NCVHS is to adopt the latest version of the core connectivity. This is version C3.1.0. Again, this version establishes a safe harbor connectivity method that drives industry alignment, converging on common transport, message envelope, security, and authentication standards. One of the key requirements and proposals for the core board is to ensure that this latest version of the core connectivity is adopted, replacing the previous versions for both the eligibility and benefits transactions, claim status transaction, remittance transaction, as well as extending these requirements for the prior authorization. It's important to understand that the latest version of the core connectivity, version C3.1.0, has very specific requirements related to transport security, submitter authentication, envelope and attachment standards, envelope metadata, etc. There have been some significant updates made to the rule to adopt and adapt to the latest versions of very specific standards. For example, in the previous version, we required the use of SSL 3.0 with only optional use of TLS 1.x. The latest version extends those requirements for SSL 3.1, but also allows for TLS 1.1 or higher to ensure that those entities that must be compliant with FIPS 140-2 can do so. We've also removed the username password, for example, from our submitter authentication. Again, this allows for the industry to adopt the digital certificate X.509 for authentication over SSL or TLS. Again, modernizing and making the rule more contemporary with the extended requirements for security and authentication. There are key benefits for this latest version of the core connectivity. First, having a single standard using SOAP plus WSDL envelope standard, for example, versus 2, allows for the industry to become more simple in its support for the core connectivity standards. Additionally, improved security. By requiring use of digital certificates X.509 based authentication, and removing security vulnerabilities of username password, implementers benefit from more robust industry standard security. Additionally, this provides support for FIPS 140-2 compliance for entities that are required for such compliance. Again, this allows for very specific requirements for security and message envelope standards. Another benefit of the latest version of Core Connectivity is that it can support additional transactions. Again, this would include eligibility, claim status, remittance advice, as well as prior authorization. As Aaron mentioned, a key component for Core Connectivity is our safe harbor requirements. This allows application vendors, clearinghouses, providers, and health plans an assured connectivity method that can be supported by any HIPAA-covered entity or Core certified entity, meaning that the entity is capable and ready at the time of the request of a trading partner to exchange data using the Core Connectivity rule. Again, this rule does not require entities to remove existing connections. Those can be maintained in, this rule does not require entities to remove existing connections. For example, while digital certificates must be used if requested by a trading partner, the rule clearly states that there is no requirement to use a Core Connectivity method if trading partners agree to use a different security requirement. For example, a VPN or SFTP. Again, existing connectivity methods can continue to be used and supported.
And finally, the new version of the Core Connectivity rule improves messaging and error reporting. Again, this is really important between trading partners to ensure that if there are issues that do arise, and they often do, these types of errors and the error reporting and the messages that come back allow for quick remediation and resolution to those types of issues. So with that, I'd like to thank you for attending. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us at core@caqh.org. Thank you, and have a good day.